And then I think I'm going to also go ahead and paste the meeting link in the Slack chat room in case in case we do get stragglers. All right. Cool. Oh, why did when I did that, it put like a little money sign at the end. That was not intentional. Okay. All right. So it is September 23 today for the cartography meeting, and then so typically what I do for at least the beginning part of this meeting is like I kind of talk about a little bit on what are the contributions and the things that we merged into the main branch like over the past month or so. And then other than that, I usually kind of let it go be driven by whoever has a topic or a issue or a pull request that they want to surface up, and then we can kind of bring it up to the group. And then sometimes like if we want to do like brainstorming, happy to do that also. I think for this particular meeting is a little bit special because I think we have Nicholas here from Convoy, who is going to be sharing with us some ways that he's been using it at Convoy, which is really cool. But yeah, before we go into that, I'll just kind of quickly go over some of the things that happened from the last time that we met. Let's see. So let me go take a look at sort of the release notes. And then it looks like, yeah, so the last time we released was back in this 0.43. And then so since then, yeah, pretty not too super active. There's just in general just bug fixes with S3 ACLs. I did improve the graph statement transactions. So there was a crash that happened here because I think that Marco, you were seeing like the graph statements take like about 2 hours to run in certain cases. And then so we replaced that with using what I think was like an explicit write transaction instead. And then like doing that turned it into, I think from hours to minutes for your case. So unfortunately doing that introduced another bug, which was fixed later on in 0.45, where the short name, I think Nicholas caught this one, where it was just putting in none. And then that was because I missed the parameter. Oops. A couple of other bug fixes I think that Ryan had pushed in, including Security Hub. And if it wasn't Ryan, then my bad. I think that there are a couple of other people that might have been involved in this also. And let's see, access of JSON. Yep. So this was for SQS, a bug fix with SQS. I think that this was something that would crash the sync. And finally, Marco, this was so this one deserves a little bit of talking through. I think that just over the past couple of days, Marco and I have been kind of talking a little bit about the idea of when you run the AWS sync, you run it on your current AWS config, right? And then so it will discover all the accounts that you have to sync in your current AWS config. And then so if you have 5 accounts that you have defined in your config, it will sync those. If later on you rerun it and then your AWS config only has 3 accounts, then what the sync will do is that it will assume that you no longer care about those missing 2 accounts, therefore running the cleanup job and giving you essentially you have just 3 accounts in your graph anymore. And so like all those last two accounts will get detached, deleted. And we decided that, okay, well, this assumption is a little bit too strong because for adopters of the tool that have a constraint of like needing to run the sync of maybe 3 accounts in the morning and then like 2 accounts later on during the day, this is just like totally a non-starter, right? We kind of make the assumption that you're going to be syncing all your accounts all the accounts that you care about at any given time. Just that if you want to split it up to parallelism, then you're going to configure it with specific resources that you have in mind. So you can like do something like specify the -- AWS requested syncs option flag. However, we want to give more flexibility. And then also in any case, like we're talking about it, and it's just the idea of blowing away every single thing tied to a single account, that's just way too broad. especially given the fact that every single one of our individual resource sinks, they all have their own respective cleanup jobs anyway. So we felt that that was a little bit redundant. And then so for the sake of safety and, kind of erring on the side of making sure that we keep the data that you care about, then let's just remove that. And happy to revisit that decision later on in the future, but just wanted to go and explain that a little bit right now for this meeting. Anything else you wanted to add, Marco?
No, mainly the use case is if you have multiple AWS organizations, then you might have multiple users and multiple had to ingest them at different times. So basically, what I was also considering, now we use the AWS account as the main container rather than the AWS org as the main container. That's what I was telling to you, Alex, yesterday. That's something that I'm gonna have a look in the future if we can maybe shift to having the org as the main node in the graph.
Oh, so you're saying like doing some, I guess, organization level discovery.
Yeah. In that case, if the org is not there, just keeping the org. If the org is not there, then delete the accounts by using the org as a main one.
What about
something I want to play about?
I was just wondering about the idea of possibly, like, you have Intel modules where it's supposed to be separate graphs. And so in some ways, the AWS could be multiple, if you think about it, like multiple applications, right? Each organization being a separate application with separate graphs. And perhaps there needs to be some sort of like high level application config where you can have like instances of application that can be defined either as a preemptive config or as a discovered config. And then kind of then have that counts be sub-objects inside of there.
Not sure I completely follow. I think you're mentioning like adding like some idea of some custom logic, I guess.
I'm just thinking that each root node of each Intel should be a concept of like an application, like based off that Intel, and then everything that's discovered inside of it goes inside of that. So instead of having some conceptual object of that Intel node be the root node, have the application sync itself be the root node, and then the data found within it is always subnodes, which would allow drift detection on the highest level node as well.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. Like, right, because that's a good point. Like, I guess the other the analogy for that in, say, GitHub would be like you could have like multiple GitHub organizations, and then so like we would so you're saying that in that case, rather than let that be the top level root node, you would just have go one level further, have a GitHub level node, which then points down to the organizations.
Yes. Another thing that I was thinking of, well, I mean, in GitHub, you actually have enterprises now, in which enterprise can have multiple organizations. And on top of that, for whatever reason, let's imagine somebody is adminning multiple enterprises. My thought is that GitHub would be a central node. Each enterprise config passed in would be a subnode, and then each organization found in there would be then subnodes of those. And additionally, the point is take the Intel module itself to be the root node, and either allow for passing of multiple configs. So like if I want to point it at two completely different GitHub enterprises, right, those would each be separate nodes within that, or either two separate applications. Like in other words, the idea that I could run AWS Intel twice with two different configs. But the point is that the application Intel, the running of an Intel would produce a root node, and then everything else would be data within that node.
Gotcha. I think I see what you're saying. Like, it might be helpful to kind of sketch it out, whiteboard it out. Like, if you can like give a diagram, and then we can kind of think about like if this would be something that we want to adopt for some modules or others, or like broadly and things like that. Yeah, sounds good. But for now, at least, yeah, the idea of removing broadly like a single entire AWS account, yeah, let's avoid that, and then like I'll kind of leave it up to the graph deployer, the implementer themselves. I'll kind of leave that up to you to manually delete anything that broad, because everything else will be cleaned up by the software itself. And so this is just kind of, again, happy to revisit this decision again. And it sounds like Nicholas has like a better ways to approach this in future with. And so let's whiteboard it out. All right. And oh yeah, before we go, let's see. I'm looking at the meeting minutes doc. Yeah, feel free to add in your own topics there. And so seeing that there's nothing here right now, I did have one of my own. I kind of wanted to do like a follow up on this Neo4j 4.x upgrade. So a little bit of background, we rely on Neo4j 3.5, which is going to be end of life at the end of November. And so that means that to keep everything up to date with our software, we have to update all of our queries and update a bunch of our code, because there are some there's some syntax breaking changes, and there's some different behaviors that we need to adjust the entire project for. I did end up messaging Dave in this issue, and then so basically, because Dave I think he works for Neo4j, but he's been really cool in helping us out with starting out this PR to convert every single module to the 4.x form. And that PR, we need to update it with like a bunch of the other new changes that have come in. And then so I was basically asking him, so what's the best way to collaborate on this? Like, should I make a PR against your branch and then continue working on there? What's the best way for two people to be working on one thing? Because I didn't want him to be the sole person taking on a big effort like that. And his reply is that, let me go and actually dig it up. I think that he said that he has it set up such that the PR is editable by contributors, should allow you to push changes to the branch associated. So we'll play with this. And again, to kind of set the expectation on pacing and time, we are going to try to get this in by the end of the year. I realized that it is going to be a big blocker for new adopters that if the open source tool relies on a graph database tool that is end of life, then yeah, we're not going to have that. So we're going to need to get this done. We're going to try to get it done by end of year. And again, the strategy here is that we're not going to run two separate forks. We're not going to run like a 3.5 fork and 4.x fork, because no, that's too much work. There's no point in doing that. And so at a certain point, I think I'm seeing that maybe the release for, I don't know, like .45, .40 something is going to be one of the last cartography versions that supports Neo4j 3.5. And then everything else after that will be 4.x only. And then so if you want to get new features and then new plugins and whatnot, that's how it'll have to go. But yeah, that's something that I'll start to take on, and then adjust some of those queries there, and then I'll try to find points to kind of maybe delegate out, like if other people have cycles, like I know that yeah, we'll see. Like at what I'll just DM other people and then see like if there's availability to come and help out with those queries. So that's our update for 4.x today. And other than that, I think that's all I wanted to kind of talk about for now. Anybody else? Does anyone have any topics or pull requests or brainstorming things that you wanted to bring up?
So one of the things about the 4x migration, this is obviously like in kind of like toy territory for me still, like I'm just playing with it. But what I worry about is, and like mine is currently deployed like to my dev machine. Like that's the only place it exists. And if I wanted to move this to production, I was intending to basically, rerun everything from scratch. But that would basically, in the future though, obviously like portability of the Neo4j database is a thing that I worry about. Like in other words, the actual content in there. And like, I know it's not like your guys' responsibility to teach people how to manage Neo4j, but I'm wondering like if there'll be any sort of guidance on like how to migrate from, one version to the next.
We'll provide some guidance, mostly because this is a path that we're going to need to go through ourselves. And then given that I think that people that have been kind of following along with the project and being running on 3.5, I mean, yeah, I think that's something we have to do. So we'll provide like well, we won't go so far as to create like the authoritative guide on how to do your database migration. We will link to those authoritative guides. I think that those things exist. I think Neo4j does a pretty good job of doing that. This is sort of uncharted territory for us because we didn't use like the version 2 or anything like that. So we've only done, I guess, minor version or patch version upgrades. And in those processes, I think that they've been fairly low risk. There's like a couple of different tricks with kind of migrating your config, and then certain options get like renamed or whatever, but then that's straightforward stuff, you know. But yeah, that's a good call out. I think that we'll definitely try to, if not provide some guidance, we will link to stuff that helps us because we're going to be going on this journey together. All right. Excuse me. Yeah. So like, if there's no other, I guess, brainstorm, no other topics or anything else like that, I think I'm going to go ahead and then turn it over to Nicholas if you wanted to go ahead and share your slides.
Yeah.
I'm going to stop presenting then.
So let me choose my screen. Okay. Okay, Google Chrome might not have screen recording permission on your computer. Give me a second.
Yeah, sure, no problem. While we're
did not test this.
That's fine. While we're waiting, I apologies if I mispronounced your name, but Satyaki, like, would you like to introduce yourself? I haven't seen you around here before. Or if not, that's totally fine. You can lurk too. And then like this video gets posted up on YouTube later on for other viewers. Oh, we lost Nicholas. He'll be back in a little bit, but yeah. Oh, and then for other people viewing online, like if you wanted to, highly recommend checking out the meeting that myself, Kunal, and Ryan had just last August 26th. We had some really good topics talking about, parallelization, talking about, talking about like, what were some other things? I just remember it was a very good discussion. There, like ideas like things that you would want exposed in the front end, things like how you would do. Kunal, you shared your way about how to do deep links, and we talked very briefly about how to do, the possible desire in the future to use Neo4j over a proxy, something like Envoy, to get something like authorization filters and fancy stuff and all sorts of crazy moonshot ideas.
Those are cool. Yeah, we also talked about temporal data, right? So looking at the data over time. We talked about how it could also become really difficult to query the graph with temporal data. Yeah.
All right, I am reconfiguring all my windows because I had to completely shut down Chrome, and that closed about 90 tabs. All right.
Well, while you're getting set up, I think that one final thing. Feel free to just share screen and interrupt me right now. Actually.
Yeah.
Hey guys, I had a question actually. First of all, let me introduce myself. My name is Satyaki. I work for Razorpay and huge fan of Cartography. So we have been using it, and we wanted to contribute back to Cartography. Now we have been using the GitHub module more intensely. So we have made some changes in the original code. We have added new retrieval things like license info and contributors and let's say and specific GitHub actions as well to that. So the question was, with these specific changes, can we contribute back to the Cartography, or I mean, that is something we are keen to know from you guys. What exactly can we contribute back to the open source?
Anything and everything, please. Like how extensive are the changes that you are that you're thinking of?
We have made quite some changes, but not to the code. We have made some changes in the utility functions. It was very specific at that point of time. We did make it a little more generic so that it could support all the functionalities that we are trying to incorporate. So we have been using GitHub. I mean, we at Razorpay use Kubernetes for deployment in AWS, right? So we have a repository called Kube Manifest, and we read all the Helm charts from there. So these are very specific changes to with respect to our organization. So that is where we are confused on exactly what can we give back, because we don't want to give anything which is very specific to our organization. Understood. So that it does not help the users who are using Cartography.
So, Satyaki, I have a couple of those similar thoughts in my presentation as well. And maybe when I'm towards the end of it, maybe we can discuss some of those solutions as well. I think what I'm going to talk about and when you're going to talk what your point is, I think correlate a lot. And I would love to chat about that more too.
Yeah. Let's talk about this more in detail, like right after Nicholas's presentation.
Sure. Yeah.
Cool. All right, everybody. Hi. I just want to pre-warn you that last week I spent the whole week doing a hackathon, and then I had to go back to being a normal security grunt at my company. And so I wrote these slides in about 20 minutes before this meeting. So they are rough. They are first draft. Eventually, this may turn into an actual presentation I give to my team, but you guys get to be my demo audience. Okay, quick introduction. I'm Nick. I work at Convoy. It's a trucking digital freight network in Seattle. Our goal is to expand the capacity of the trucking industry through technology means and eliminate waste. So the idea that we do is that we reduce the time that both shippers and carriers take to get and match up with loads by eliminating a lot of the middleman. And there's a lot of middleman that's involved in this industry. It's a very fractured industry. No single broker owns more than like 10% of the whole market, and it's like a couple $1 trillion TAM. So it's a pretty big industry that we're making some progress and putting some changes in. I'm on the security team. Our team is very small, about 3 people for about a 1,500 employee company. 300 to 400 of which are like data science and engineering. The rest of which are like sales, operations, etc. And our team formed about 2 years ago. And as you can probably imagine, we have a lot of priorities that are higher than a lot of toy projects. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our Moonshot, which is our hackathon. And so our internal hackathon week is called Moonshot. If there's one thing that we really like to do at Convoy is to theme things. And so we theme trucker nature things around everything. And Moonshot is our kind of like theme for this, and we just wrap the two together. So we have like Apollo awards and stuff, but all of our merchandise and stuff all looks like it's somewhat space themed. Last year was a couple years ago was Apollo related. So basically, it's our opportunity to take a week off and do something that we think would help the company, thinking big about problems that maybe we're not addressing, etc. And the reality of it is that we take this very serious. We pretty much stop all production work for the whole week for the whole company, and as much as we can reduce everybody's workload down to just the point of you can go work on a project. We do everything we can to fill in the gaps between people, but the reality of it is like everybody really kind of just stop work and to do something new. So this is kind of like from our internal websites, like why we do this, like what exactly is it, and yeah, we're really serious about making everybody available. We spend a lot of time on this, setting up infrastructure for it, and then we spend a lot of time judging, and we like literally bring in our founders, we bring in investors, we show them these things, and a lot of our current product offerings came from Moonshot projects. So like we're very serious about this. So what was my problem that I wanted to look at? I wanted to look at attack surface, threat models, and incident response, all security related themes. We have a Beyond Corp model deployed in AWS, heavily rely on dozens of SaaS providers to host, deploy, analyze, authenticate, store, etc. We're a no corporate network. All of our resources are in the cloud. We use SaaS apps for everything, and everybody works from home. And well, we worked in the office, and I'm in our office right now that's empty. But basically, when we went to home, like nothing really changed because we already had that mentality. So for a security team, what do we need to know? We want to know what are our resources that are deployed? How are they configured? Who has access? When something goes wrong, what else might be affected? Pretty standard security team, IR process. We do a lot of SDLs at the like team level, but it's very hard for us sometimes to keep in mind the total attack surface and like how everything interacts together. We have various solutions that we deploy in different levels for this. Like this isn't like we're not trying to rely on this as our only crutch. We have other things that we look at, but it would be nice if we could ask questions or able to see and explore and dive into issues. In long term, how do we detect or understand how our deployment has changed, or potentially if there's like unauthorized resources, things unexpected. So that brings us to my moonshot, the Trucker Atlas, based off cartography. We love truckers. We tend to find creative ways to wrap things in their allegories. And so Trucker Atlas is a more specific road atlas used by truckers to find routes through states and highlight details that are more specific to their needs. So you might go to the gas station and pick up a state atlas, and it'll point out points of interest and show you where malls and retail stuff is. A Trucker Atlas has big, thick, deep lines that show like trucking routes and roads that are safer for trucks to go down, and places where notes out where there are low bridges and things. So it's a same thing but with a different idea. So this is the way I'm looking at cartography is, a way to look at and analyze all of our resources that are deployed, but in a way that we can then draw correlations between them, draw new information that's interesting to us. That shouldn't be in there. All right, so I first found out about cartography probably somewhere around 2019. I was thinking about making a graph to link our various SaaS applications when I first started Convoy. I had basically been doing some other graph-like work in previous job, and I was like, hey, we have all these APIs to all these places. We could just pull all this information and start linking together. And I started thinking about ways to do that. And somebody mentioned cartography. I think I went and watched a B-Sides presentation about cartography, but it has been mostly on my back burner for a very long time, mostly because I have lots of other high priority things to work on. We have a lot of ruthless prioritization in our org. We literally say of these top 3-4 things, which one is going to cost us the most money if it goes bad, and that's what we prioritize on. And while this type of tool would totally be valuable to us, it wasn't a priority. So that's where Moonshot 2021 came in. I would have done it last year, except for last year I was running Moonshot, so I didn't really have time to do Moonshot. This year was the first year I didn't run Moonshot, so I actually had an opportunity to do something technical. All right, so what was my plan? My plan was to deploy cartography locally, sync AWS, Okta, GitHub, find connections, and then start building a set of questions and answers. So let's get trucking. Not everything went smooth. It never does. It's hard. Basically, I'm not a Python guy, but I'm a true hacker. So give me a language and an environment, and I'll just start smashing into it as much as I can. One thing we ran into very quickly is that the cartography / Python / Bot03 all runs off of config files and makes no assumptions about environment variables. So everything we do for our CLI and everything else is all about like setting up our environment variables to have all the information. So I was, we use AWS Okta to sync our, from Okta, we get authorization SSO, to do assume role into our AWS account. And so our normal role that we assume into is our developer read-only role. And that is the default issue. So I was trying to assume into the specific role that had the security audit access. And when I was doing that, basically, no matter how I would do it, I couldn't get permissions to work through cartography. And basically, I then found out about the setting up the environment variable to say like run as this environment. But the problem with it is that our whole system relies on the fact that it would eventually prompt you for credentials from Okta if you needed them. And that wasn't working for me. So in the end, what I ended up having to do was to basically call our Okta presentation, like our Okta command line, set the environment variables, and then export those actual values back into the AWS config. So I had to go backwards. Normally, you would like take AWS config and maybe set environment variables. I was going the other way around. I was taking environment variables and setting them back in the config. And I needed to set all of these things. However, what I figured out eventually was that if I set all these things, I could actually assume our long-acting role, which was because our prod RO is good for 12 hours, but all the other assumed roles are 1 hour max. And I was running into problems where if I was to pull the actual configuration stuff for the security account, Cartography would often not finish before I was done, and then I'd have a sync problem. So then I figured out that I could set the profile to prod audit and call Cartography with all this stuff set, and then it could renew its own tokens because I was setting the AWS security token. So that was like the first problem. The second problem that I ran into was exception handling. Almost anything that throws an exception is not caught and basically will stop your sync, which also means you have to start over from scratch because all the syncs are based off of the sync tags, which is based off of an ID put in, and if you want everything else to sync and finish together, it has to be a start to finish sync. That's really rough. I kind of wish there was more of a way to either have a demo, like a specified tag, and maybe there is, and I just didn't time to find it, or to have it like resume a sync that had crashed before. I found 2 or 3 different exceptions that I either manually fixed internally to just throw exception handling around, or ultimately resulted in a bug that had to be fixed externally. So I found the SQS parsing bug where they were using index instead of find, which threw a value error exception if it wasn't found. I also found some other exceptions so that one was actually in the universal policy thing. So I filed a bug externally to them as well as put in the exception handling on our side. And then there was some other issue with that was, so SQS and S3 bucket parsing, sorry. S3 bucket parsing was the one that was universal policy. Nonetheless, eventually was able to wrap those and get most of us sync to work, and then got some completely done. But then the last thing is like my deployment is not like yours. And this kind of goes back to Satyaki's point, which is assumptions on generic versus specific. And I really wasn't sure what I needed to do because there were places where I wanted to add more content into the Intel modules, but at the same time, I wasn't really sure if this was going to either be too specific to my deployment or to, or like, for example, like especially with policy syncing stuff, obviously people want to have different things and there's a config file for that. But for other things that you want to sync and config, it's not as obvious how to configure some of those. So one of the things I ended up adding was node groups for EKS that weren't there previously. And I probably will push that back to the original project, but there are other places where I want to pull like more details about certain types of objects that may not be put into the node graph today. And those, I worry about putting too much detail that other people don't care about, and then having that basically be polluting other people's graphs and overweighting them. And so it's like, I still have this problem of like, where do we add new content features that are going to be useful for everybody? But like, perhaps there needs to be some sort of configuration file. I brought up as another point that it'd be kind of interesting if there was models for each of the objects that existed, because one of the things you do is you did have a models is then you could have model masking or something. Like you could have a configuration file that took an existing model and either removed parameters from it or whatever to make your model simpler for your deployment, and it would just ignore things that weren't in the model per se. That's just a thought. But it seems like there's different ways that you could bring more configuration processes in to have people configure their graph and configure their sync that is more clear than just having to go modify code and then wonder if they should push it back into the project or not. So I'm running out of slides, like I said. But a couple of things that I wanted to talk about really quick was that our company is moving to Kubernetes pretty rapidly. We're about halfway to crossed over from ECS services to Kubernetes. And Kubernetes introduced a big problem for us in that in ECS, we have services that are all named, and they actually have resources in AWS that are named. So I can actually go search for a resource, like a service name, and find its resources in the current graph. However, in Kubernetes, all of those services, all those containers and modules now become Kubernetes metadata. And so when you look at it from an AWS resources perspective, it's all about clusters and node groups and autoscaling groups for your EKS deployment, and absolutely nothing about the individual services. There's no more AWS objects that are customly named towards those things. There may be some resources like RDS, databases or other sort of resources that are deployed as well. But generally speaking, like getting back to like EC2 instances or subnets or relationships between those services, it's all now Kubernetes meta objects. So I was starting to deploy Kubernetes, and when we go to a demo later after we stop the recording, I'll show a little bit about like what I started to do. But it was one of those things of somebody else is going to have something in the next week or two, but I've got 1 week to do it. So I kind of like half did it, never really got into my graph, but I started like the actual like Python side code to like pull the data, and so I can start analyzing it. But a couple of the learnings I came to, tagging and other metadata pieces that can be used to correlate resources is super valuable. I realized that I have a problem right now with merging my GitHub side of like graph to my AWS resources, and that's like a key thing for me. I really want to be able to go from code to AWS resources. And I realized that I'm either going to need to have something in my deployment. We use Terraform for all of our deployment. Have something in my deployment, either tag Kubernetes or AWS resources with a GitHub like tag or some sort of metadata that I can put in there so that when I scan it, I can then go backwards. Or I was going to have to write like a Terraform parser, where I was going to have to actually go look at Terraform, parse it, and then use that to bridge the actual repo to resources. And I think this is kind of gets into like implementation specific detail problems where like, especially with Kubernetes, we start reaching new abstraction layers, is like, how do we bridge these graphs in meaningful ways? And I haven't really gotten into like the analysis side of cartography. It's like one of the last areas that I was like starting to get to. And so I don't really know like what is the intended implementation specific bridges between things, and like how we want groups to like, how you want to create your custom things. I assume that's where it would probably done best at, but it's really not known. And like, as I was looking at some other tagging issues that I found, for example, I found that autoscale groups don't import their tags. And it's like a well-known issue with one of the AWS APIs that they don't import autoscaling groups. And I was like, all right, well, there's this other way to get it. And then I was like, well, how do I start crossing Intel resources together when like links are done kind of at the time of creation? So there's this whole idea that if you're creating a new module and there are at least the account module, you can go back, you can create that link immediately. But what happens if you want to create links across two different modules? Or for example, like tags to auto-scaling groups, like how do you import them and then run that later? Like how do you run that that linking to those things together? And so I think there's still some user guidance on like development and deployment nature of like how, like when you have this thing that you want to connect together, or when your environment, it has this difference from this base assumption, what is the path forward? Because just writing your own module to import a new thing isn't really the answering that question. The real question is all right, I have two resources I want to correlate that are already being pulled by somebody else's modules, but I need either new pieces of data inside of them, or I need to associate those data in some other way. Like what is that pattern? So I see that as an opportunity to like guide people in like more advanced like customization of their graph and their import. So that's really where I got to. I have other learnings that we for Convoy itself. For example, we don't deploy our auth roles in the assumed manner. Like we don't do the regex group basing. Like we actually have manually named assumed IAM roles and manual IAM groups. And we're not manual, but the point is we associate those two in the actual Okta series. So basically, there was nothing from Okta that was bridging over to any of our other resources, which means that either I need to go change the way our Okta groups work and like create those new subgroups, assign people to them, and then start using the regex, or I need to find a new way to associate Okta to GitHub and to AWS, which it wasn't really clear to me how I would go do that. So those are kind of the things I've learned. I'm going to keep this on my back burner as my little side project that I'll keep working on for a while. Just because I have done nothing to clear my data, I really don't want to share any of my stuff. So I'm happy to discuss more about the other GitHub or the other specificity of like what to contribute back, what should versus like how do you do customizations of your own area. And then when we're done with that, if you want to stop the recording, I'm glad to do some live demos for everybody here to show you what I've gotten so far.
Sounds good.
Take questions right now as well.
Sounds good. First of all, thank you very much for putting this together with the presentation and having such detailed feedback for us. This is super, super helpful. Let's see, like I can maybe try to answer some of your questions, maybe kind of give you a little bit more context on like the background behind certain decisions, and then like maybe I can start like with these bullet points, if that works. Or yeah. So let's see, with like auth config and then like Python environment variables and configs. Yeah, I feel the pain point here. I think that the tool makes an assumption that you are going to have things set up very similar to the way that we have it running at Lyft, and then that is specifically like config files and things like that. I believe that we do. I've personally gotten it working with like environment variables without needing to use a scripts that you described there, but again, yeah, we would definitely need a better, I guess, guidance and documentation around that point. A lot of it is that it's tricky to abstract Boto3, if that makes sense, because Boto3 receives its credentials from like 5 different ways, either like the envar or the config or other multitude of ways, and then like finding the right way to expose that without essentially rewriting the behavior of Boto3. It's a little bit of an exercise, but having that story be clearer for adopters, I 100% agree there. I'm glad that you're able to figure that out, though. But then, yeah, ideally, yeah, let's talk more about that because it should be smoother for a new adopter.
I think it took me about a day to get the first cartography run working.
Okay.
So morning of the Monday, I started installing everything, and by Monday afternoon, I had finally found a way to get it start running. And I think Tuesday was when I figured out that I could push my base role 12-hour credentials into the config to allow the because I was originally pushing the 1-hour credentials into the config, but then I figured out I could push my base role 12-hour ones in there and allow it to reassume with the security auth token. So I kind of got it partially working, and then like it would fail because of like, an hour later it would fail when the sync was not done. So I think we should probably, just documenting like the baseline assumptions that all of these variables are filled in the AWS config. And basically like if you assume role somehow do what you need to do to make sure those are completely filled in.
I'll make a note of that. Yeah.
It does say, like the AWS config, and it just points at it. But if I can probably just show you really quick. My AWS config is a completely valid AWS config. Right this. So I've this is like a copy of it. So this is a perfectly legitimate config. It's how you would set it up for AWS Okta. It has a SAML URL, and it's got like assumed roles that are based off of each other. But like when I run this config for AWS CLI, it works just fine because in the CLI, it'll make the calls to AWS Okta to get the credentials and then it set the environment variable. So the AWS CLI works fine. If I were to run AWS Okta with a execution parameter, so I could put like instead of doing like this where I'm setting it to the environment variables, I could just say AWS Okta exec with my prod and then tell it to like run a command. It would pass those environment variables to that command. And so all this just assumes that environment variables are going to work for that thing that ran. And the config file is quote unquote valid, but I think we need to be more explicit that the actual tokens and credentials file need to be populated with tokens.
Yeah, that's interesting. We didn't, the way that we have it is that we don't have the tokens filled out in the file. I'm kind of interested why it didn't quite work that way for your case.
So the only one that goes in here that it comes from this run here is the security token. The session token, secret access, and access key ID all go into the creds file.
I see.
But the security token, which is used for redone, goes into the config.
Yeah.
But the point of it is like, if those aren't set, but keep in mind, all this is based off the idea that the MFA provider is Okta.
Okay.
Right.
Got it.
So my whole config roles are based off of this Okta AWS config.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. The sort of the, I guess, happy path that we are very familiar with is having this running on an AWS instance, whether it be like a cron facet or something, or like something on AWS where you do have your EC2 instance metadata, and then you just kind of auto magically get all of those things and without needing to put that in. But,
exactly.
For the scenario of like having like what you said, populating it this way, yeah, that's not we need better expectations there.
Yeah, I think the key is just like very explicitly, Botto 3 needs to have everything it needs to know in the AWS config file.
Okay.
And like that means you may need to know specifically, but it's like if it makes external calls, using another CLI or whatever to make those calls, then you should assume that you need to populate the AWS credentials into the file.
Got it.
That was just like one part of it, obviously.
Yeah, this is helpful. Okay, we got like maybe 8 minutes left. I want to make sure that I kind of talk a little bit some of my thoughts on here. So on exception handling, yes. So the sort of philosophy around here, if you can call it a philosophy, is that when there are failures, then we would rather fail the entire sync than continue on with like a partial sync. And there are places where we sort of break this rule, but for the most part, we lean toward failing everything when there is a issue because for that reason. That said, there is an issue that I believe it's still open where we should have this behavior configurable, where like somebody who wants to continue on and accept those failures, like it could possibly log a warning that you can look at later on saying, oh, we weren't able to get details on this specific asset because there's a permission error or something. You should go and look at that. And then you can look at those logs. For right now, though, the way the tool is, we tend toward failing frequently noisily, and then so like when you get a full sync in, but then otherwise, like I think that there's cases where I think Marco has added like other error handlers, such as for like handling regions and whatnot. So in those cases, we do that log warning and continue. However, I agree we should revisit that issue of error handling and letting that be configurable.
Yeah, I think configurable soft fail, like hard fail, soft fail, quiet, kind of concepts would be great. The other thing that I want to call out is this AWS requested syncs parameter is not in the help file, it's not in the man. And it is only when somebody mentioned it to me in the Discord, which by the way was I didn't call it out here, but the Discord was super active. And as far as like the Slack was super active. And as far as other like open source things go, like having an active Slack where people will literally answer your question within a couple hours is like amazing. So that was super helpful for like Moonshot would not have happened if there was an active Slack for me. I would have like basically been hammering my head against the wall for a lot of this stuff. I got a lot faster. So this needs to be in the man. But on top of that, what I think would be more interested, and I think I saw somewhere in there like idea of having a config that has the set of syncs that you want to do, like sub-level syncs as well as high-level syncs.
Right.
What would be interesting is if you had you had a way to populate a file that said like as like a log, maybe like a meta output config. Like when you run it by default, it would create all of the things it was going to do, output them to a file, and then as it ran through that, it would then use that config file to run. And then when you're done, you have a copy of the literal configs that was being ran, so that you could rerun just that config file. But if also when it failed, it could say like which item failed. Then that way you could just go delete everything but that one, or possibly even create a rerun config for this with the same tag, so that you could rerun. So if you were doing a soft failure, you could rerun with the same tag after you've perhaps fixed that module or that point, and like resume that specific rerun. But that reentry would be so much more useful for people who are getting started. Like I can understand like once you're already in place and you've got a deployed system, like you want to kind of maintain the rigidity of it. Like, you know, if you have a failure, you want to address it. But like in startup mode, you need to have more reentry.
Makes sense. And then the third point, so I think this was kind of the larger discussion about like which of these custom code bits are something that I can contribute back versus which is something that's specific for me, and then how do I avoid polluting other people's graphs and things like that. And then so like, do I have that correct so far? Or?
Yeah, that's one part. And I think another part is just the, there seems to be guidance on writing a new Intel module, but there isn't really much guidance on like augmenting slash combining or like, you know, interacting between modules. It's just like, you know, it's like assume that this is what you have. If you don't have it, you're like, all right, well, I need to add more. But is adding more, like there should be something that is like context specific. Like what is the difference between my environment versus the tool just doesn't have it yet.
Got it.
Like, and like if I want to just augment for something for me, how do you do that versus if I want to increase the scale of the module, how do I do that? Which I think kind of goes back to Satyaki's point, which is, you know, which of these things are mine and how should I have done those properly? And which of these things are expanding and how do I contribute that? And how do you separate the two?
Yeah, so I'll do my best to kind of capture this. There's a couple of different things. Regarding customizations, you mentioned, you can always contribute a brand new plugin, you know, and adding more. But like you said, it's not always the answer when you want to go and do correlations between two existing assets already. So you have, again, you know, you can contribute a new plugin. So like in particular, you know, if there's, for example, a particular AWS data type that has a well-defined API defined by Bodo or whatever, and we don't support that data, that's straightforward. You know, just like contribute that new plugin, we'll be happy to accept it. Other cases, like such as there are already two existing assets, but we don't draw correlation between those things. One possible way of looking at that could be to consider the use of an analysis job. So something like we have there is a doc on this, but like the idea about like being able to take existing parts of your graph, and then once the data is in the graph already, then you can kind of perform some calculations to determine things like, oh, you know, given this set of AWS network assets, are these assets actually open to the internet or not? So you can do like sort of adding new relationships or adding new fields to existing nodes to give you more of that enrichment into the data there. Sort of the third way of customization that I'll add here is custom syncs. So what you can do is the standard cartography entry point, you just run the command line and then it will, you know, go through that same, that's the standard sync.py sync process, where it has like a bunch of tuples and it defines like what things will hit, what things that you will get into your graph. And so, so you're showing that right here, where this is sort of one example where you can build your own custom sync and kind of define your own entry points. And each of those entry points will be a function pointer that accepts a Neo4j session and a cartography config object. And then sort of, I think that you already have that defined here where you're doing AWS and something with Kubernetes. And then like potentially like because every organization is going to be very specific. Like there's certain things like the way that Lyft defines what a service is that is not portable anywhere else outside of Lyft. So we have like a separate set of modules that takes those service definitions and ingests those and then has it in the form of this like chain right there. And that's kind of how, that's sort of like how we're doing that.
Okay. So I think probably the thing I was thinking about, like, so for example, like I noticed that in EKS that it looked like EKS was very new, and I know that like Kubernetes in general wasn't yet a part of this, and so they were mostly just pulling clusters, and that was like the only thing they were pulling.
Yes.
But they weren't pulling any node groups, which is like the only other EKS object really. And so like I started to add the EKS node group. Now I'm pretty sure that this is all going to be like a part of, like should be a part of cartography. And so I'll probably contribute this back in. But like updating this, one of the things I noticed in the dev guides, it was like you could make some assumptions, but it wasn't very clear like what things you need to do to augment this. So like, for example, I needed to add tags for this.
I see.
And so I was basically searching for anywhere I saw EKS cluster and trying to do something similar there. But that was literally like my path was as I did a code search for EKS cluster, because that was a keyword that I realized. And anywhere else it had that, I was like, all right, well, I need to go create something like that here.
I see.
And then I'm like, now I'm parsing like, what is this doing and why is it doing there? Because this wasn't a part, there was no guide on how to do that. Additionally, like, oh, there's these jobs and cleanup. And when I was going to look at these, I'm like, what is the purpose of these? And then like, because I hadn't really gotten to a point of writing my own module where I had written, full updated and cleanup sections of it. So I was kind of assuming that I needed to write these two, but like when you go look at other places where they have them, for example, like tags cleanup, they don't necessarily have doubles for each of these. And so like for EKS cluster, this was not in here at all. So there was nobody had done any work on here for EKS cluster for tags. So if it was tagged with EKS cluster, this didn't exist. I added this as well as that. And I just copied one of these other ones and tried to make it like it. And I probably haven't done this right. I probably need to go add more parts to it.
That's a good catch. That's a good catch. Yeah, that's definitely a bug if that's not in there. Yeah.
Yeah, and so like that, but that none of this is well defined on like the augmentation process.
Understood.
Of what you need to do. And then, like I said, I haven't gotten to analysis yet, but I assume that like, for example, my Okta not linking up to my AWS roles is probably something that I'm going to need to go write my own custom analysis rule for to do today. But yeah,
that's one possibility. Yeah, I would say like the main thing of using an analysis job would be like if you don't want to write Python, and if you're able to define all those things in Cypher language, then do so. Or if you find the Cypher language too, I guess, constricting for what you want to do, and you need to do that post-processing in Python, by all means, add another module. To your point earlier about like what order do I at what entry point do I have the ability to add in like a node group and then connect it to a cluster? I think that the first decision is, well, which one should be synced in first? And then so like I would say that in this case, probably it's more straightforward to allow the cluster itself to be synced in first and then rely on that cluster to be there. And then it seems like we need to find a way to uniquely identify the cluster that you're connecting the node group to. And then
that's all in here.
Okay, yeah.
No, so this is pretty much done. I was just testing it. Like I've already ran all of this and it all works properly.
Gotcha. Yes.
So I'll probably contribute this back whenever I get some time to actually put it back in.
Yeah.
But like I think I have this mostly done, but I wasn't quite sure about like, there's a lot of information in a node group. And one of the other things is like, how much of that meta information that might be interesting to me versus to somebody else should I bring in? And so I started off with trying to go with as minimal as possible without bringing too much in. But like there was like, for me, it was super important to get to auto-scaling group. So I very specifically grabbed auto-scaling information out of there. But there's other stuff like security groups or things that I didn't pull in that are probably there. And like, so it has like security groups. It also has like remote access, EC2, SSH key pairs, and all these other things that were in there. And I'm like, well, how much of this do I want to populate in here right now? And that kind of comes back to the how, yeah. Well, I'm sorry, Satyaki, I didn't give you much chance to talk on your own. Sorry about that.
Yeah, reach out on Slack. We'll continue the conversation there after the recording. Sorry about the, yeah.
No issues, guys. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for joining.
Do you want to wrap up the
yeah let's wrap up and then kind of continue the conversation offline then. Sounds good. Okay. Well, thank you very much for sharing this. I'm going to go ahead and then turn off the recording, and then you'll make it available on YouTube shortly.